Montana Territory, 1873. The wild, untamed frontier stretched before Isaac Porter like the canvas of his life, vast, demanding, and utterly devoid of tenderness. At 26, he'd already learned what the West taught all men eventually. Attachment was a luxury, and love was a distraction that got men killed. The harsh landscape had shaped him into a solitary figure, his lean, muscular frame hardened by years of breaking horses and driving cattle across unforgiving terrain. As he guided his chestnut mare along the ridge overlooking the Sweetwater Valley, the June sun beat down on his tin Stetson. His clean-shaven face, weathered but still youthful, reflected a handsome severity that kept most people at a distance, exactly as he preferred. 6 years of working other men's ranches had finally yielded enough savings to purchase his own modest spread, and that was all he needed. A man, his land, and his horses. Nothing more complicated things like hearts and promises. A man stands alone out here, he often told himself, watching the evening light play across the distant mountains. The moment you start needing somebody is the moment you lose everything. He'd seen it happen too many times. Good men distracted by sweet words and soft touches, only to end up with bullets in their backs or hanging from trees. His own father had died chasing after a woman who'd run off with a silver-tongued gambler, leaving Isaac orphaned at 14. The lesson had been clear: survival demanded solitude. Yet in quiet moments, when the coyotes howled and the stars scattered across the night sky like spilled silver dollars, a hollowness would settle in his chest. He called it hunger, fatigue, or just the natural weariness that came with building something from nothing. He never called it loneliness. The following morning, Isaac rode into Sweetwater Springs for supplies. The small but growing town had sprouted up around a natural spring that served as a waypoint for settlers heading further west. As he tied his horse outside the general store, he noticed an unusual commotion at the stagecoach stop. Another day, another batch of Easterners with no business being out here, grumbled old Pete, the local blacksmith, as he passed by. Some banker family from Boston. Fancy clothes that'll be ruined in a week. Isaac paid little mind to the news. Eastern transplants rarely lasted a season before scurrying back to civilization. He entered the store, nodding curtly to Mrs. Holloway behind the counter as he handed over his supply list. "Did you hear about the Jordan family arriving?" Mrs. Holloway asked, her eyes bright with the excitement of fresh gossip. "Mr. Jordan's come to open a bank. Brought his daughter with him. Pretty little thing, she is. About 20 years old, I'd say. Good luck to them," Isaac replied flatly, focusing on counting out coins for his purchases. Just then, the bell above the door jingled, and a cool breeze seemed to sweep through the stuffy store. Isaac turned instinctively toward the sound and found himself looking at a young woman unlike any he'd seen in Sweetwater Springs. She wore a sky-blue dress that somehow remained immaculate despite the dusty journey. Her honey-blonde hair was partially pinned up, with soft curls framing a face that combined delicate features with startlingly determined blue eyes. She carried herself with the confident grace of someone accustomed to society's comforts, yet there was something in her direct gaze that suggested steel beneath the silk. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the refined lilt of Eastern education. "I am Abigail Jordan. My father and I have just arrived, and I was hoping you might direct me to where I might purchase some stationery." Mrs. Holloway practically leapt to assist her, leaving Isaac standing awkwardly with his half-packed supplies. As the older woman fussed over Abigail, showing her various papers and inks, Isaac found himself lingering longer than necessary, oddly transfixed by the newcomer's small hands as they carefully examined each item. When Abigail looked up and caught his gaze, Isaac quickly averted his eyes, feeling strangely exposed. He hastily gathered his supplies and headed for the door. "Sir," her voice stopped him. "Might I ask if you know of any horses for sale in the area? I'm quite fond of riding, and Father has promised I might have a mount of my own." Something about her forthright manner made Isaac pause. "Horses around here aren't like the gentle mounts you'd find in Boston parks, Miss Jordan." A flash of irritation crossed her face. "I assure you, Mr. Porter. Isaac Porter. Mr. Porter, I've been riding since I was 6 years old. While I'm certain Western horses have their peculiarities, I'm not some fragile doll who needs to be warned away from every challenge." The unexpected fire in her response stirred something in Isaac. Respect, perhaps, or simple surprise. Before he could think better of it, he said, I break and train horses. Got a few that might suit you. Your father's welcome to bring you out to my place to take a look. Her expression softened into a genuine smile. Thank you, Mr. Porter. I shall tell him of your kind offer. As Isaac left the store and mounted his horse, he felt oddly unsettled. The encounter had lasted barely 2 minutes, yet somehow his carefully ordered world seemed slightly off-kilter. He dismissed the feeling as he rode back to his ranch. Abigail Jordan and her father would likely be gone by winter, driven away by the first harsh blizzard or Indian threat. The frontier had no place for Eastern delicacy, and Isaac Porter had no place in his life for complications, especially ones with honey-blonde hair and eyes that saw too much. 3 days later, Isaac was repairing a fence line when he spotted a wagon approaching his property. Shading his eyes against the sun, he recognized the driver as Jonathan Sims, who sometimes worked as a driver for hire in town. Beside him sat 2 passengers, a distinguished older gentleman in a black suit and, to Isaac's surprise, Abigail Jordan. Her hair was now braided and pinned up beneath a modest bonnet, but a few rebellious strands danced in the prairie wind. She wore a simpler dress than before, dark green and practical, though still finer than anything the local women possessed. As the wagon drew closer, Isaac could see her scanning the ranch with undisguised curiosity. Mr. Porter, called the gentleman as the wagon stopped. Harold Jordan, I understand you might have suitable horses for my daughter. Isaac wiped his hands on his trousers and approached. I do, sir. Got 4 that are gentle enough for a lady but spirited enough for someone who knows riding. Excellent. Abigail has been quite insistent about establishing her independence here. There was fond exasperation in his tone. I'd prefer she have a reliable mount rather than whatever questionable creature she might procure on her own. Abigail stepped down from the wagon without assistance, her eyes already fixed on the corral where several horses grazed. Father exaggerates my willfulness, Mr. Porter. I merely pointed out that proper transportation will be essential if I'm to fulfill my duties at the school. School? Isaac couldn't hide his surprise. Yes, she said, turning those direct blue eyes on him. I'm to be Sweetwater Springs' new schoolteacher. The position has been vacant for nearly a year, I understand. The news took Isaac aback. He'd imagined the Jordans as temporary visitors, not people intending to put down roots. A banker and a schoolteacher, civilizing influences in a town that had gotten along just fine without such refinements. Well, he said finally, let me show you the horses. As they walked to the corral, Isaac noticed how Abigail's gaze swept appreciatively over the modest ranch he'd built. Unlike many who came from the East, she didn't seem to be comparing it unfavorably to what she'd left behind. You've accomplished quite a lot on your own, Mr. Porter, she observed. How long have you had this ranch? Just shy of 2 years. Started with the cabin and 10 acres. Now up to 80 and 15 head of cattle. Impressive, she said simply, and somehow her lack of effusive praise made the compliment more meaningful. At the corral, Isaac whistled, and a beautiful dappled gray mare trotted over. This is Willow. 5 years old, steady temperament, but she'll run when asked. Best of the 4 for a lady's mount. Abigail approached the fence, and to Isaac's surprise, the usually cautious Willow extended her nose immediately. As Abigail stroked the horse's muzzle, she murmured something too soft for Isaac to hear, but the mare's ears pricked forward attentively. She's lovely, Abigail said. May I? Understanding her request, Isaac opened the gate and brought Willow out. He retrieved a saddle from the nearby shed, one of his smaller ones that might better fit her frame, and efficiently prepared the horse. When he finished, he turned to find Abigail had removed her bonnet and was rolling up the sleeves of her dress. Allow me, she said, taking the reins from him and mounting with a fluid grace that spoke of years of practice. She settled into the saddle with natural ease, adjusting her skirts modestly but practically. Isaac stood back as she walked Willow in a circle, getting the feel of the horse's gait. Then, without warning, she clicked her tongue and the mare broke into a trot, then a canter, circling the open area beside the corral. Isaac watched with growing admiration as she guided the horse with subtle shifts of weight and gentle rein pressure, clearly experienced and confident. When she returned, her cheeks were flushed and her eyes bright with pleasure. She's perfect, Mr. Porter. responsive but not skittish. What are you asking for her? Before Isaac could answer, Harold Jordan approached. Is this the one you want, Abigail? Yes, father. She's exactly what I need. The banker turned to Isaac. Name your price, Mr. Porter. My daughter's safety is worth whatever you consider fair. Isaac hesitated. Willow was worth at least $60, but something made him say, $50, Mr. Jordan. And that includes the saddle and tack. He saw a flash of surprise in Abigail's eyes. She clearly knew enough about horses to recognize he was offering a favorable price. Sold, said her father promptly, extending his hand. As they shook on the deal, Isaac found himself wondering why he'd made such a generous offer. Perhaps it was simply good business to curry favor with the town's new banker. As Harold returned to the wagon to retrieve payment, Abigail dismounted and stood close to Isaac, still holding Willow's reins. Thank you, she said quietly. Not just for the fair price, but for not treating me as if I were made of china. You'd be surprised how many men assume a woman from the East must be helpless. You ride better than most men around these parts, Isaac admitted. Wouldn't do either of us any good to pretend otherwise. A smile spread across her face, not the polite, measured expression from town, but something genuine that transformed her features into something so radiant it almost hurt to look at directly. I shall take that as high praise. Coming from a man who clearly knows horses, she said. Perhaps you might show me some of the local riding trails sometime? It would be good to learn the lay of the land. The request caught Isaac off guard. It was a perfectly reasonable suggestion, yet somehow fraught with implications he wasn't ready to consider. I'm sure any number of locals would be happy to guide you, Miss Jordan. Something like disappointment flickered in her eyes before she nodded. Of course, I didn't mean to impose. As the Jordans prepared to leave, with arrangements made for Isaac to deliver Willow to town the following day, he found himself fighting an unfamiliar urge to retract his refusal. But that would be foolish. Entanglements with the banker's daughter, especially one who combined beauty with intelligence, was exactly the kind of complication his life didn't need. Let someone else show Abigail Jordan the hidden waterfalls and secret meadows that dotted the landscape around Sweetwater Springs. Isaac Porter had a ranch to build and cattle to tend, alone as he'd always been. Yet as he watched the wagon disappear down the dusty road, he couldn't deny the strange emptiness that settled over the ranch, an emptiness that hadn't seemed so noticeable before Abigail Jordan's arrival. The schoolhouse sat on the edge of Sweetwater Springs, a simple clapboard building that had fallen into disrepair during its year without a teacher. As summer progressed, Isaac began hearing stories in town about how the banker's daughter had rallied the community to help restore it, how she'd convinced the saloon owner to donate lumber, organized women to sew new curtains, and even climbed onto the roof herself to help replace missing shingles. Never seen anything like it, remarked Jenkins at the feed store. Got my boy Tommy actually looking forward to school starting in September. That Miss Jordan's got a way about her. Isaac merely grunted in response, but he'd noticed the changes himself on his infrequent trips to town. Abigail Jordan seemed to be everywhere, helping at the general store, teaching some of the women to read in evening classes, riding Willow through town with a confidence that drew admiring glances. She'd quickly shed any appearance of Eastern fragility, adapting to frontier life with surprising ease. He'd managed to avoid more than passing encounters with her, exchanging brief nods when their paths crossed. Yet he found himself inexplicably aware of her presence, as if some internal compass had been calibrated to her location. In late July, a severe summer storm unleashed its fury on the region. Thunder crashed overhead as Isaac struggled to secure the last of his livestock in the barn. Rain lashed down in blinding sheets, turning the ground to treacherous mud. He was soaked to the skin and exhausted when he finally fought his way back to his cabin. As he pushed open the door, lightning illuminated a figure huddled on his porch. For one terrifying moment, he thought it might be a drifter seeking shelter. He'd already reached for his revolver when a familiar voice called out over the storm's roar. Mr. Porter, thank goodness. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. Miss Jordan. Abigail stood shivering against the cabin wall, her dress plastered to her body and her once neat hair hanging in sodden ropes around her face. Despite her bedraggled appearance, relief shone in her eyes as she saw him. What in God's name are you doing out here? Isaac demanded, pulling her inside and quickly lighting a lamp. I was returning from the Anderson homestead. Mrs. Anderson had her baby early and needed help. Her teeth chattered as she spoke. The storm came so suddenly, and the creek flooded. I couldn't get back to town. Isaac cursed under his breath. The creek between his property and town turned treacherous during heavy rains. She'd been right to seek shelter rather than attempt a crossing, but the impropriety of her situation now struck him forcefully. "You're freezing," he said, moving to stoke the dying embers in his fireplace. "And in serious danger of illness if you stay in those wet clothes." A flush that had nothing to do with cold spread across Abigail's cheeks. I realize this is terribly improper, Mr. Porter. I assure you I wouldn't have come if there were any alternative." Isaac sighed, running a hand through his own dripping hair. "Propriety takes second place to survival out here, Miss Jordan. That's lesson one of frontier life." He moved to his trunk and pulled out a clean flannel shirt and a pair of trousers. "These will swallow you whole, but they're dry. You can change behind that screen while I make some coffee." The small cabin suddenly seemed impossibly intimate as Isaac busied himself with the coffee pot, acutely aware of the soft rustling sounds as Abigail changed. When she emerged, he almost smiled at the sight. His clothes indeed engulfed her slender frame, the shirt sleeves rolled up multiple times and the pants cinched tight with a piece of rope. She braided her wet hair into a simple plait that hung over one shoulder. "Thank you," she said quietly, still looking embarrassed but considerably less miserable. "I promise I'll leave at first light." Isaac handed her a steaming cup. The creek might not be passable by morning. These storms can last days. The implications hung in the air between them. Abigail took a sip of coffee before meeting his eyes directly. "I understand your concern for my reputation, Mr. Porter, but I trust you are a gentleman, and I assure you I am perfectly capable of explaining the circumstances to anyone who might question my absence." Her calm practicality in the face of what could be a ruinous situation for an unmarried woman impressed him. Most ladies of his limited acquaintance would be in hysterics by now. "It's not just your reputation I'm concerned about," he admitted. "The banker's daughter found alone at a bachelor's ranch. Some might expect me to make an offer of marriage regardless of the circumstances." To his surprise, Abigail laughed, a warm, genuine sound that somehow filled the cabin's empty corners. "Are all Western men so quick to assume marriage is the only honorable solution? In Boston, we're slightly more practical about natural disasters." Despite himself, Isaac felt his lips twitch toward a smile. "Perhaps Boston has more civilization than I gave it credit for." "Or perhaps less," she countered, her eyes twinkling. "After all, we have no shortage of social disasters, just fewer involving flooded creeks and stranded schoolteachers." The tension in the room eased somewhat, and Isaac found himself relaxing into conversation with Abigail as the storm raged outside. He learned that she'd trained as a teacher in one of Boston's finest women's colleges, that her mother had died when she was 16, and that she and her father had come west partly for his banking prospects, but also for a fresh start away from painful memories. "And what of you, Mr. Porter?" she asked as they sat before the fire. "What brought you to this particular stretch of Montana?" Isaac rarely spoke of himself, but something about the storm's isolation and Abigail's genuine interest loosened his tongue. "Needed land of my own. Worked cattle drives from Texas to Wyoming for years, saving every penny. This place wasn't much when I found it. Previous owner died in an Indian raid. But the water rights were good, and the price was right." "You've built something remarkable," she said softly. "It takes courage to claim a piece of wilderness and transform it." Her understanding struck a chord in him. "Most see only what's missing, proper town, proper society. They don't see the freedom." "I see it," she replied, her gaze meeting his across the small space. "The freedom to create rather than merely inherit. The chance to build something that truly reflects one's own vision rather than simply accepting what others have established." Isaac stared at her, startled by how precisely she'd articulated what he'd always felt but never expressed. That's exactly it. The air between them seemed to shift, charged with a current of mutual recognition that went deeper than the circumstances of their meeting. For one dangerous moment, Isaac was acutely aware of her presence, not as the banker's daughter or the town's teacher, but simply as a woman whose mind somehow matched his own in unexpected ways. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, breaking the spell. "You should take the bed," Isaac said abruptly, standing. "I'll sleep by the fire." Abigail began to protest, but he raised a hand. "One thing you'll learn about the West, Miss Jordan, we may lack some social graces, but we do have our own code of honor." She studied him for a moment before nodding. "Thank you, Mr. Porter." As Isaac arranged blankets near the hearth, he wondered how a simple summer storm had so thoroughly disrupted the careful isolation he'd built around himself. One night, he told himself firmly. One night, and then things would return to normal. But as he drifted toward sleep, the sound of Abigail's steady breathing from across the cabin stirred something long dormant within him. A dangerous whisper that perhaps normal had been missing something essential all along. The storm lasted 2 full days. 2 days of confined proximity in the small cabin, where Isaac and Abigail established an uneasy routine of careful distance and surprising connection. They took turns cooking simple meals from Isaac's stores. He showed her how to repair a loose floorboard. She discovered his small shelf of books and expressed delight at finding Milton's Paradise Lost among them. "My father had a battered copy," Isaac explained as she ran her fingers over the worn binding. "Read it to me when I was a boy. Didn't understand half of it then, but the words stayed with me. 'Long is the way, and hard, that out of hell leads up to light,'" she quoted softly. "I've always found comfort in that line. The acknowledgement that difficult journeys can lead to something worth the struggle." On the afternoon of the second day, the rain finally stopped. They walked together to check the creek, picking their way through mud and debris. The water still ran high, but had dropped enough that crossing would be possible by morning. "I can't thank you enough for your hospitality, Mr. Porter," Abigail said as they stood watching the rushing water. She had changed back into her own clothes, now dried before Isaac's fire. "You've been more than kind. Anyone would have done the same," he replied, uncomfortable with her gratitude. She turned to face him, her expression serious. "We both know that's not true. Many men would have seen advantage in this situation, not responsibility." The directness of her statement silenced any platitudes he might have offered. After a moment, he simply nodded in acknowledgement. They walked back to the cabin in companionable silence. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Isaac found himself struggling with an unexpected reluctance to see morning come. Abigail's presence had filled spaces in his home he hadn't realized were empty. Her laughter when she'd accidentally dropped an entire pot of beans, her thoughtful questions about his plans for the ranch, the simple comfort of another human voice breaking the solitude he'd always claimed to prefer. "What will people say?" he asked suddenly as they prepared a final meal together. "When you return to town after 2 nights away?" Abigail considered this as she sliced bread. "The truth will suffice. I was caught in the storm and took shelter at your ranch. You behaved as a gentleman, and I return unharmed. And if they don't believe that?" Her hands paused, and she looked up at him. "Do you always concern yourself so much with the opinions of others, Mr. Porter? I thought you valued your independence." "Independence is one thing. Being the cause of gossip that damages your standing in the community is another." A small smile played at her lips. "How curiously protective you've become of my reputation. I assure you, I can weather a few raised eyebrows. Besides," she added, resuming her task, "I've never much valued the esteem of people who would assume the worst without evidence." Her confidence both impressed and worried him. The frontier could be merciless to women who defied convention, regardless of their innocence. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Isaac saddled Willow while Abigail gathered her few belongings. As she mounted, the early sunlight caught in her hair, turning it to spun gold. "Thank you again, Mr. Porter," she said, settling into the saddle. He nodded, suddenly finding words difficult. "Take care crossing the creek. Stay upstream of the fallen cottonwood." "I will." She hesitated, then added, "I hope our paths will cross again soon, under less dramatic circumstances." Before Isaac could respond, she guided Willow away, looking back once to wave before disappearing down the trail toward town. Isaac stood watching long after she'd gone from sight. The cabin behind him seemed unnaturally silent, as if it too felt the absence of her presence. With a muttered curse at his own foolishness, he turned back to his chores. Life would return to normal now. It was better this way. Yet as the day progressed, he found himself moving through tasks with mechanical efficiency, his mind repeatedly drifting to conversations by firelight and the way Abigail's eyes had lit up when discussing books or her plans for the school. Twice he caught himself glancing toward town, as if expecting to see her riding back across his land. This was precisely the distraction he couldn't afford, the dangerous pull of connection that led men to lower their guard against the frontier's harsh realities. He'd built his life on self-reliance, and 2 days of unexpected company couldn't change that fundamental truth. By evening, Isaac had convinced himself that the strange hollowness he felt was merely the natural adjustment after having company. It would pass, like all things on the frontier. He would see Abigail Jordan in town occasionally, exchange polite greetings, and that would be the extent of their connection. The school term would start, winter would come, and life would continue as it always had. Alone, but free, just as he preferred it. A week passed, then two. Isaac avoided town as much as possible, sending one of the local boys to fetch supplies when needed. He threw himself into ranch work with renewed intensity, extending his fences, breaking 2 new horses, and repairing the roof of his barn. But Abigail's presence in Sweetwater Springs proved impossible to ignore entirely. Stories of her activities filtered back through visitors to the ranch. How she'd organized a town library in a corner of the church. How she'd already begun preliminary lessons for children eager to learn before the official school term. How she rode Willow confidently through town and along the surrounding trails. Miss Jordan was asking after you, mentioned Jim Davis, who'd brought a load of lumber for Isaac's barn repairs. Seemed concerned you might be avoiding town on her account. Isaac grunted noncommittally as he helped unload the wagon. Told her you've always been a solitary sort, Jim continued, eyeing Isaac curiously. Though folks are wondering about those 2 days during the storm. Miss Jordan says you were quite the gentleman, but you know how people talk. Let them talk, Isaac said shortly. Nothing happened worth gossiping about. Jim shrugged. Well, whatever did or didn't happen, she's got half the unmarried men in the county finding excuses to visit that schoolhouse. Tate Wilson's already started courting her proper, bringing flowers and offering to escort her to church socials. The news shouldn't have bothered Isaac. Abigail Jordan was free to accept courtship from whomever she pleased. Yet the thought of Tate Wilson, a prosperous rancher with a spread 3 times the size of Isaac's, but half the character, bringing flowers to Abigail stirred an unexpected surge of irritation. Good for Wilson, he said flatly. Now, are you going to help me with these boards, or just stand there spreading gossip like an old woman? Jim raised his eyebrows, but wisely changed the subject. That evening, as Isaac sat alone on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in fiery hues, he found himself remembering how Abigail had quoted Milton. Long is the way, and hard, that out of hell leads up to light. The words echoed in his mind, carrying a meaning he wasn't ready to examine too closely. 3 days later, necessity finally forced Isaac into town. His last plow blade had broken, and the blacksmith didn't make deliveries. As he rode down Sweetwater Springs Main Street, he felt unnaturally self-conscious, aware of curious glances and whispered comments. At the blacksmith shop, old Pete greeted him with knowing eyes. Been wondering when you'd show your face, Porter. Thought maybe you'd decided to become a complete hermit after all the talk. Just been busy, Isaac replied tersely. Need a new plow blade. Got one nearly finished. Can have it ready by tomorrow. Pete wiped his hands on his leather apron. You might as well go say hello to Miss Jordan while you're in town. She asks about you whenever anyone mentions your name. Isaac frowned. I'm not here for social calls. The older man shrugged. Suit yourself. But that girl's brought more life to this town in a month than we've seen in years. Might do you good to remember there's more to living than just surviving. Irritated by the unsolicited advice, Isaac turned to leave and found himself face to face with Abigail herself. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet, and she carried a stack of books under one arm. Mr. Porter, she said, genuine pleasure lighting her features. How wonderful to see you in town. Isaac removed his hat awkwardly. Miss Jordan. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them as Pete busied himself at the forge, obviously listening while pretending not to. I hope you've been well, Abigail finally offered. Your ranch recovered from the storm without too much damage, I trust. Well enough, he replied. Then, feeling the inadequacy of his response, added, And you? Settling into town life. Her smile returned. Yes, quite well. The school will officially open next week, though I've already begun some informal lessons. The children here are eager to learn. They've had so little opportunity. As she spoke about her plans for the school, her face animated with enthusiasm, Isaac found himself remembering why her company had been so unexpectedly enjoyable during those stormbound days. Her passion for education wasn't the shallow interest of someone seeking to impose Eastern refinement on frontier children. It came from a genuine belief in possibilities. "I've been meaning to thank you properly for your hospitality," she continued. "Father and I would be honored if you would join us for dinner this Sunday after church." The invitation caught Isaac off guard. Dinner with the banker and his daughter would be noted by everyone in town. It would either quell rumors by suggesting the storm incident had been as innocent as they claimed, or it would fuel speculation about his intentions toward Abigail. Before he could formulate a response, a new voice interrupted. "Miss Jordan, I've been looking all over for you." Tate Wilson approached, his broad frame blocking the sunlight from the shop entrance. At 35, Wilson was one of the territory's most successful ranchers, with a 3-story house that stood as a monument to his prosperity. He nodded curtly to Isaac before turning his full attention to Abigail. "I've brought those books on Montana history you mentioned wanting," Wilson said, producing a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Ordered them special from Helena." "How thoughtful, Mr. Wilson," Abigail replied, accepting the package with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "They'll be a wonderful addition to our growing library." Wilson beamed, casting a triumphant glance toward Isaac that made something tighten in the younger man's chest. "I was hoping you might allow me to escort you to the church picnic next weekend. Weather should be fine, and it's the last big gathering before school starts." Isaac knew he should excuse himself, but something kept his feet rooted to the spot as he watched the interaction unfold. "That's very kind," Abigail said carefully, "but I've already promised to help Mrs. Holloway prepare for the event. Perhaps another time." Wilson's smile dimmed slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Of course, your dedication to the community is one of your most admirable qualities." He tipped his hat. "I should be going. Good day, Miss Jordan." "Porter." As Wilson departed, an awkward silence fell once more. Pete had abandoned all pretense of working and was openly watching them with undisguised interest. "About Sunday dinner," Abigail said finally, returning her attention to Isaac. "I hope you'll consider coming. Father has been eager to meet you properly." Put on the spot, Isaac found himself saying, "Thank you for the invitation, Miss Jordan. I'll be there." Her smile was worth the discomfort of the commitment. "Wonderful. 3 o'clock, then. Our house is the new white one just past the church." As she bid him goodbye and continued on her way, Isaac wondered what had possessed him to accept. Sunday dinner with the banker meant clean clothes, conversation, and navigating social niceties he usually avoided at all costs. Well, Pete chuckled from behind him. "Looks like the hermit's rejoining civilization after all." Isaac scowled. "Just finish my plow blade, old man." But as he rode back to his ranch that afternoon, he couldn't deny a strange anticipation for Sunday's dinner, or the unsettling realization that Tate Wilson's attention to Abigail bothered him far more than it should. Sunday arrived clear and warm. Isaac bathed in the creek, shaved carefully, and put on his one good shirt and clean trousers. He even polished his boots, a concession to propriety he rarely bothered with. Looking at his reflection in the small mirror above his wash basin, he hardly recognized the man staring back at him. The Jordan's house sat on a slight rise at the edge of town, a handsome 2-story structure painted pristine white with green shutters. It was modest by Eastern standards, perhaps, but grand by frontier measures. As Isaac tied his horse to the hitching post, he felt acutely out of place. Abigail herself answered his knock, dressed in a rose-colored dress that complemented her fair complexion perfectly. Her honey-blonde hair was arranged in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck, with a few soft tendrils framing her face. "Mr. Porter," she greeted him warmly. "Please come in. Father is in the parlor." The interior of the house was tasteful but not ostentatious. Good furniture that had clearly made the journey from the East, mixed with locally crafted pieces. It spoke of comfort without unnecessary display, and Isaac felt himself relaxing slightly as Abigail led him to the parlor. Harold Jordan rose to greet him, extending his hand with genuine warmth. "Mr. Porter, a pleasure to have you in our home. Abigail has spoken quite highly of your kindness during the storm." "It was nothing, sir," Isaac replied, accepting the handshake. "Anyone would have done the same." Perhaps, the older man said with a thoughtful expression, but not everyone would have shown such respect for a young woman's reputation. You have my gratitude. Dinner proved surprisingly enjoyable. The food was excellent. Roast beef, fresh vegetables from the garden Abigail had started behind the house, and an apple pie that she proudly declared she'd baked herself. Harold Jordan proved to be an intelligent conversationalist, well-informed about the territory's development and genuinely interested in Isaac's perspectives on ranching in the region. You've accomplished a great deal for a young man, Jordan observed as they enjoyed coffee after the meal. Abigail mentioned you purchased your land outright rather than homesteading. Yes, sir. Preferred to own it free and clear from the start. A wise approach. Too many rush into claiming land without understanding the capital required to make it productive. Jordan studied him over the rim of his cup. Have you considered expanding your operation? The question took Isaac by surprise. Eventually. Need to increase my herd first, improve the existing structures. Sound thinking. When you're ready to consider expansion, I hope you'll come to the bank. Men with your work ethic and practical approach are exactly the sort the territory needs to develop properly. The conversation shifted to other topics, but Isaac noted the banker's words carefully. Bank loans were something he'd avoided on principle, preferring to build slowly with his own resources. But Jordan's implicit offer suggested possibilities he hadn't considered feasible for years. As the afternoon waned, Harold excused himself to review some papers in his study, leaving Isaac and Abigail alone in the parlor. A brief awkwardness descended as they adjusted to the absence of her father's mediating presence. "Thank you for coming today," Abigail said, breaking the silence. "Father enjoys intelligent conversation, and too many visitors are simply attempting to curry favor with the town's only banker." "I appreciated the invitation," Isaac replied honestly, "though I'm not sure I provided much in the way of intellectual stimulation. On the contrary, your practical knowledge is refreshing after so many theoretical discussions." Father was quite impressed. An unexpected swell of pride warmed Isaac at her words. "He seems a fair man, different from what I expected of an Eastern banker." Abigail smiled. "Father has always valued substance over appearance. It's why we left Boston, in many ways. After Mother died, the constant social obligations felt hollow. Endless conversations with people who spoke well but said nothing." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "That's what I appreciate about the West. There's less pretense, more honesty about what matters." "Not always comfortable honesty," Isaac observed. "Perhaps not. But I'd rather face uncomfortable truths than comfortable lies." She met his gaze directly. "Like the truth that you've been avoiding town because of me." The directness of her statement left no room for evasion. "Not because of you, exactly," he admitted after a moment. "Because of what people might say about your reputation. And yet your absence has generated more speculation than your presence would have." Her tone held no accusation, merely observation. Whispers grow louder in a vacuum. Isaac shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not good at navigating social waters, Miss Jordan. Seemed simpler to stay away." "Simpler for you, perhaps," she replied softly. "But I've missed our conversations." The simple admission hung in the air between them. Isaac found himself studying her face. The intelligence in her blue eyes, the quiet strength in her expression, the gentle curve of her lips. Something dangerous stirred within him, a longing he'd refused to acknowledge since the storm. "I should go," he said abruptly, rising to his feet. "Thank your father again for his hospitality." Disappointment flickered across her features, quickly masked by a polite smile. "Of course. I hope we'll see you in town more regularly now." As she walked him to the door, their hands brushed briefly, an accidental contact that sent an unexpected current through Isaac's body. He stepped back quickly, nodding a somewhat stiff goodbye before striding to his horse. Riding away from the Jordan house, Isaac felt profoundly unsettled. The afternoon had confirmed what he'd been trying to deny. His interest in Abigail Jordan went far beyond mere acquaintance. Her intelligence, her quiet courage in facing frontier life, the way she saw possibilities where others saw only limitations, all of it drew him in a way no woman ever had before. And that was precisely the problem. Allowing such feelings to develop would be inviting vulnerability into a life carefully constructed to avoid it. Caring meant risking loss. Attachment meant creating weakness that the harsh realities of the frontier could exploit. Yet as the miles between himself and Sweetwater Springs grew, Isaac couldn't shake the memory of Abigail's words. "I've missed our conversations." For simple words that somehow threatened the carefully constructed walls of his solitary existence. The school term began in early September, and with it came new rhythms to Sweetwater Springs. Children who had previously spent their days helping with chores or running wild now gathered each morning at the freshly painted schoolhouse, their voices raised in recitation and laughter. The transformation was remarkable, not just in the children themselves, but in the town's growing sense of permanence and civilization. Isaac found himself in town more frequently, though he told himself it was simply the natural increase in business as harvest approached. If his errands sometimes coincided with the school's dismissal time, allowing him glimpses of Abigail bidding farewell to her students, it was mere coincidence. On one such afternoon, he was loading supplies into his wagon when a small commotion near the school caught his attention. A group of boys had surrounded a smaller child, their taunting voices carrying across the street. Isaac recognized the victim as Tommy Miller, whose twisted leg from a birth defect made him the frequent target of bullies. Before Isaac could decide whether to intervene, Abigail appeared on the schoolhouse steps, her voice cutting through the jeers with commanding clarity. "William Tucker, James Peterson, Stephen Morris." To me, immediately. The boys froze, then reluctantly shuffled toward their teacher. Though Isaac couldn't hear her words, her expression combined disappointment with resolve in a way that clearly affected the chastened boys more effectively than anger would have. After a moment, they nodded and turned to Tommy, offering what appeared to be awkward apologies. When the children had dispersed, Abigail remained on the steps, watching until Tommy had safely joined his waiting mother. Only then did she notice Isaac observing from across the street. Rather than looking embarrassed at being caught in a disciplinary moment, she crossed to join him. "Handling schoolyard justice, Miss Jordan?" he asked, impressed by her effective intervention. She sighed, adjusting the books she carried. Children can be remarkably cruel when they perceive difference, but they can learn better if given proper guidance. "Tommy's had a rough time since his family moved here last year," Isaac observed. "His father works for the railroad, doesn't have much time to teach him to stand up for himself." Abigail studied him thoughtfully. Sometimes standing up for oneself isn't the answer. Sometimes it's having a community that refuses to tolerate cruelty. She paused. "I've been teaching the children about how frontier survival depends on cooperation, not just individual strength. Some lessons take longer to sink in than others." Her philosophy struck Isaac as both wise and contrary to much of frontier thinking, where self-reliance was the highest virtue. Before he could respond, she changed the subject. "I'm pleased to see you in town more frequently, Mr. Porter. Are you finding it less uncomfortable than you feared?" He managed a small smile. "The gossip seems to have found more interesting targets." "Yes, Mrs. Peterson's chicken allegedly laying an egg with 3 yolks has quite captured the town's imagination," she replied with gentle humor. Vastly more exciting than a schoolteacher caught in a storm. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tate Wilson, who rode up on his expensive black stallion. He dismounted with a flourish, tipping his hat to Abigail while barely acknowledging Isaac's presence. "Miss Jordan, I was hoping to catch you. I've just returned from Helena with news about the Territorial Education Committee. Thought you might be interested in their latest curriculum recommendations." "How thoughtful, Mr. Wilson," Abigail replied with the same polite but reserved manner Isaac had observed before. "Though I must admit the territorial guidelines tend to be somewhat behind modern educational theory." Wilson laughed as though she'd said something delightfully charming rather than mildly critical. "Your progressive thinking is exactly what makes you so special, Miss Jordan. Perhaps you might share your insights over dinner this Saturday? My housekeeper makes an excellent roast duck." Isaac found himself holding his breath as he awaited Abigail's response. "That's very kind," she said carefully. "But I've already promised to help with preparations for the Harvest Festival. Perhaps another time." Wilson's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "You work too hard, Miss Jordan. All these community commitments leave little time for personal enjoyment." "I find community work quite enjoyable, Mr. Wilson," she replied pleasantly but firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have papers to grade before tomorrow's lessons." She nodded to both men and turned back toward the school, her straight-backed posture conveying a quiet dignity that Isaac couldn't help admiring. Wilson watched her go, then turned to Isaac with narrowed eyes. Enjoying town life these days, Porter? Quite a change from hiding out at your little ranch. The deliberate condescension pricked Isaac's temper, but he kept his voice level. Just getting supplies, Wilson. Not all of us can afford to spend our days riding to Helena for school reports. Wilson's mouth curved into an unpleasant smile. You know, there's quite a pool going in town about how long it'll take Miss Jordan to accept my courtship. Most give it till Christmas. The smart money says Thanksgiving. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. A woman of her quality doesn't belong in a one-room cabin with dirt floors. She deserves the finer things, things a man of means can provide. The implication was clear. Stay away from what you can't possibly offer. Isaac felt a surge of anger, not just at Wilson's arrogance, but at the uncomfortable truth beneath it. Abigail Jordan did deserve more than a struggling rancher could provide. Miss Jordan seems capable of deciding for herself what she deserves, Isaac replied evenly, turning back to his wagon. Good day, Wilson. As he drove out of town, Isaac's thoughts churned with frustration. Wilson's crude assumptions about Abigail's priorities revealed more about the wealthy rancher than about the woman he claimed to admire. Yet Isaac couldn't deny that his own small ranch and modest circumstances paled in comparison to what Wilson could offer. The questions that had been circling his mind for weeks crystallized into painful clarity. What did he really have to offer a woman like Abigail Jordan? And what made him think he had any right to compete for her attention when his entire life had been built on the principle of self-contained solitude? The autumn weeks passed in a blur of harvest activity. Isaac hired 2 local boys to help bring in his modest crops and prepare the ranch for the coming winter. The work left little time for trips to town, though he found himself thinking of Abigail often, wondering how her school term was progressing, whether the harvest festival she'd mentioned had been successful, if Wilson had finally worn down her polite refusals. In late October, a fierce early blizzard swept through the territory, dropping nearly 2 feet of snow in a single night. When the storm finally cleared, Isaac spent days digging out his livestock and repairing wind damage to his barn. The unexpected cold snap was a harsh reminder of the frontier's unforgiving nature, and of how quickly circumstances could turn deadly for the unprepared. A week after the blizzard, Isaac finally made it to town for desperately needed supplies. Sweetwater Springs looked transformed under its white blanket, smoke rising from chimneys into the crisp blue sky. As he loaded flour and coffee into his wagon, Sheriff Taylor approached with a grave expression. Porter, glad to see you made it through that storm. Been worried about folks in outlying areas. Lost 2 calves, but otherwise came through fine, Isaac replied, noting the lawman's concerned demeanor. Something wrong? Taylor nodded grimly. Miller family, the ones with the boy with the bad leg. Their place is about 5 miles east of yours. Haven't been seen since before the blizzard. Supposed to come in for supplies 4 days ago. Isaac frowned. The Millers had a small homestead in a somewhat exposed location. With a disabled son and a father often away working for the railroad, they'd face challenges in a severe storm. Anyone gonna check on them? That's why I'm talking to you, Taylor said. Wilson led a group yesterday, but turned back when the snow got deep, said it wasn't worth risking horses for what's likely a lost cause. The sheriff's disgust was evident. I'd go myself, but I've got a prisoner to transport to the territorial prison. Was hoping you might take a look on your way home, since it's not far off your route. I'll check, Isaac agreed immediately. They had winter preparations in place. Should have. Tom Miller's not a fool, just stretched thin with that railroad job. But with that boy, Taylor didn't need to finish the thought. A disabled child complicated every aspect of frontier survival. After gathering additional supplies that the Millers might need, Isaac set out. The journey was slow, the snow still deep in places where drifts had formed. He found himself thinking of Tommy Miller, the quiet boy whose intelligence shone in his eyes despite the cruel taunts of his classmates. Abigail had defended him, seen his worth beyond his physical limitations. The thought spurred Isaac to push forward despite the challenging conditions. As he approached the Miller homestead, an unnatural stillness hung over the small cabin. No smoke rose from the chimney, and no tracks marred the snow around the house. Not a good sign after several clear days. Isaac's concern deepened as he dismounted and approached the door, which stood slightly ajar. Hello? Tom. Mrs. Miller, he called, pushing the door open further. The scene inside confirmed his worst fears. The family lay huddled together on a bed in the corner, Mrs. Miller in the middle with Tommy and his younger sister pressed against her for warmth. Their faces were pale, with the bluish tint of extreme cold. A small fire had clearly died days ago, and a thin blanket of snow had blown in through a broken window. Isaac rushed forward, checking for signs of life. To his immense relief, he detected shallow breathing from all three, though they were deeply unconscious from the cold. Working quickly, he built a fire in the cold stove, using the emergency kindling he'd brought. As flames finally caught, he assessed their situation more thoroughly. The broken window explained much, likely damaged during the height of the blizzard. It had allowed freezing air to pour in. Without Tom Miller at home to repair it, and with their woodpile nearly exhausted, the family had succumbed to the cold, huddling together in a last desperate attempt to survive. For the next hour, Isaac worked frantically. He melted snow for warm water, gently raising the family's temperature with warm compresses. He repaired the window with a board from their shed, stoked the fire to blazing heat, and wrapped them in the extra blankets he'd brought. Gradually, Mrs. Miller began to stir, then Tommy, though the younger child remained deeply unconscious. Isaac Porter. Mrs. Miller's voice was weak, her confusion evident. What? The storm. Save your strength, Isaac told her gently. You've been without heat for days. The blizzard broke your window. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by fear as she looked at her still unconscious daughter. Emily? Is she? She's alive, but needs medical attention, Isaac said honestly. All of you do. I need to get you to town. Mrs. Miller struggled to sit up. Tommy can't make the journey in this cold. His leg, I'll take care of everything, Isaac assured her. First, drink this. He helped her sip warm broth he'd prepared from his supplies. The gravity of the situation was clear. The family was too weak to travel conventionally, and nightfall would bring deadly cold again. Isaac made a swift decision. He would need to create a sled to transport them all at once. Working with grim efficiency, he dismantled the Miller's small table and part of a storage chest, using the wood and some rope from his supplies to construct a rough sled. He hitched it to his strongest horse, padded it with blankets, and carefully moved the family outside. Mrs. Miller was barely conscious enough to help, but Tommy had revived enough to hold his sister's limp form. We need to go fast, Isaac explained as he secured them on the makeshift sled. The cold will be dangerous, but slower travel would be worse. Hold on to each other and stay under the blankets. The journey to town was a grueling test of endurance. Isaac led his horse on foot, choosing the path of least resistance through the snow. The sled runners caught occasionally, forcing him to lift and push. His hands grew numb, then painful, then numb again. But the thought of the children depending on him, particularly little Emily, who had yet to fully regain consciousness, drove him forward. As dusk approached, the lights of Sweetwater Springs finally appeared in the distance. Isaac's relief was tempered by exhaustion and concern for his precious cargo. He pushed on toward the doctor's house at the edge of town, his legs leaden with fatigue. His arrival created an immediate stir. Dr. Hayes rushed out, quickly assessing the situation and calling for assistance. Within minutes, the Millers were being carried inside while others took charge of Isaac's horse and the makeshift sled. You got here just in time, Dr. Hayes told Isaac as they worked to warm the family. Another night in that cabin without heat. Isaac nodded grimly, understanding the unspoken conclusion. As feeling returned painfully to his extremities, he became aware of another presence in the doctor's house. Abigail, who had apparently been helping with another patient when Isaac arrived. She worked alongside the doctor with surprising competence, helping to tend to little Emily, while speaking soft encouragements to Tommy, who looked to her with trust amidst his fear. It was only when the immediate crisis had passed, with all three Millers stabilized and resting, that she turned her attention to Isaac. You should let the doctor examine your hands, she said quietly, noticing how he flexed his fingers against the returning circulation. Frostbite is nothing to ignore. I'm fine, he insisted. Just need to warm up a bit. Abigail's expression grew stern. Mr. Porter, you've just saved 3 lives through extraordinary effort. Please don't endanger your own health through stubborn pride. Something in her tone, concern wrapped in firmness, made resistance futile. Isaac submitted to examination, wincing as Dr. Hayes manipulated his reddened fingers. Minor frostbite, the doctor pronounced. Could have been worse. Keep them warm, use this salve, and they should heal without lasting damage. He glanced between Isaac and Abigail. Miss Jordan, perhaps you could help Mr. Porter apply the first treatment? I need to check on Emily again. As the doctor moved away, Abigail took Isaac's hands in hers, gently applying the medicinal salve. Her touch was careful but sure, her concentration evident in the slight furrow between her brows. The simple contact of her fingers against his created a warmth that had nothing to do with returning circulation. What you did today, she began softly, not meeting his eyes as she worked. When Sheriff Taylor told me where you'd gone, after Wilson had already declared it too dangerous. Wilson gave up too easily, Isaac said, surprised by the edge in his own voice. They would have died by morning. Abigail's hands stilled, and she finally looked up at him. The admiration in her eyes made something catch in his throat. You risked your life for that family. Not many would have done so, especially for a crippled boy and a railroad worker's family. Isaac finished when she hesitated. Tommy Miller's worth isn't measured by his leg, and their lives aren't worth less because they're not wealthy ranchers. A smile touched her lips. That's precisely what I've been trying to teach the children. That true value lies in character, not circumstance. She resumed applying the salve, her touch even gentler. You exemplified that lesson today in a way no classroom teaching ever could. Her praise made him uncomfortable, unaccustomed as he was to such direct appreciation. Anyone would have. No, she interrupted firmly. Not anyone. Mr. Wilson and his men turned back. You did not. She finished bandaging his hands and stepped back slightly, though her gaze held his. There's a strength in you, Isaac Porter, that has nothing to do with physical power. It's a strength of spirit, of doing what's right regardless of personal cost. The use of his first name, so natural in that moment, created an intimacy that seemed to shrink the room around them. For once, Isaac didn't fight the connection. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps something fundamental had shifted during those desperate hours fighting through the snow with 3 lives depending on him. Abigail, he said quietly, testing her name for the first time. I'm not the man you think I am. I've spent years avoiding connections, responsibilities beyond my own land. What happened today doesn't change that, doesn't it? She challenged gently. You keep insisting you prefer solitude, yet your actions speak of a man deeply connected to the welfare of others. Before Isaac could respond, Dr. Hayes returned. Tommy's asking for you, Miss Jordan. And you, too. Porter, surprisingly enough. They found Tommy sitting up in bed, his color much improved. His mother dozed in a chair nearby, exhaustion having finally claimed her. Mr. Porter, the boy said, his voice stronger than Isaac expected. Ma says you saved us. Made a sled and everything. Isaac shifted uncomfortably. Your ma did the hard part, keeping you all alive until help came. Tommy shook his head with a child's certainty. Wilson said we were goners. Heard him tell Sheriff, so when they came yesterday, didn't even try to get close enough to see if we were alive. His young face hardened with understanding beyond his years. He looked at our cabin and decided we weren't worth saving. The simple truth of the boy's assessment hung in the air. Abigail placed a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder. What matters is that Mr. Porter saw differently. He saw your worth. Tommy nodded solemnly. Miss Jordan's been teaching us that in school. About how Indians judge a person by their courage and generosity, not by their possessions or their bodies. He glanced down at his twisted leg. Said a true man is measured by how he treats those who can't help themselves. Abigail's cheeks colored slightly. I see you've been paying attention in history lessons, Tommy. The boy's serious expression gave way to a small smile. Yes'm, and I saw today that you were right. As Isaac left the doctor's house some time later, the events of the day settled into a new perspective. The Miller family's survival had come down to a simple choice: to see value where others saw only inconvenience, to recognize humanity where others saw only burden. It was the same choice Abigail made daily in her classroom, teaching children like Tommy that their worth transcended their limitations. For years, Isaac had believed protection came through isolation, that safety lay in avoiding connections that could be severed by the frontier's harsh realities. Yet today had shown him the flaw in that thinking. The Millers hadn't been endangered by their connections to others, they'd been saved by them. As he walked through the quiet, snow-covered town, Isaac found himself wondering if his long-held belief about frontier survival had been fundamentally wrong. Perhaps true strength wasn't found in standing alone against adversity, but in standing together against it. And perhaps Abigail Jordan had understood this truth all along. News of the Miller family rescue spread quickly through Sweetwater Springs, transforming Isaac from a respected but distant figure into something of a local hero. The change made him profoundly uncomfortable. He'd never sought recognition and found the increased attention at odds with his preference for privacy. Yet he couldn't deny that something had shifted within him as well. His trips to town became more frequent, and he found himself lingering, stopping to help Mrs. Holloway unload a delivery at the general store, assisting the blacksmith with a particularly difficult horseshoeing, joining conversations at the feed store that he would previously have avoided. Most significantly, he began making regular visits to the schoolhouse, initially under the pretense of checking on Tommy Miller's recovery, but increasingly because he enjoyed watching Abigail teach. She approached education with a passion that transformed the simple clapboard building into a place of possibility. Children who had never encountered books before hung on her every word as she read stories of far-off places and historical events. On one such visit in early November, Isaac arrived as classes were ending. The children filed out, calling cheerful goodbyes to their teacher. Tommy, now fully recovered from his ordeal, gave Isaac a gap-toothed grin as he limped past, proudly carrying a paper covered with sums he'd completed correctly. Inside, Abigail was arranging books on a shelf she'd recently added. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows, catching in her hair and creating a golden halo effect that momentarily stole Isaac's breath. "Mr. Porter," she greeted him warmly, turning at his entrance. "This is becoming quite the regular occurrence. People will talk." There was gentle teasing in her voice, but Isaac detected a question beneath it. Their interactions had taken on a new quality since the rescue. A comfortable familiarity marked by increasingly personal conversations, yet still bound by propriety's constraints. "Let them talk," he replied, surprising himself with the ease of the response. "I've discovered I don't much care for others' opinions." Abigail's eyebrows rose slightly, a significant change in perspective for a man who once avoided town to prevent gossip. "Perhaps I've realized some things are worth a little gossip." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was quite ready to address directly. Abigail busied herself with straightening papers on her desk. "Tommy's doing remarkably well. His understanding of mathematics is quite advanced for his age." "He's a bright boy," Isaac agreed, moving to help her lift a heavy stack of books. "Deserves the chance to develop that intelligence." "That's what I believe about all my students," she said passionately. "So many of them have potential that would be wasted without education. Especially the girls." She glanced at him, as if gauging his reaction. "Most people think teaching girls anything beyond basic reading and sewing is a waste." "Most people are fools," Isaac said simply. "Intelligence doesn't belong to one sex any more than courage does." Her smile was radiant. "Precisely. Yet you'd be surprised how many educated men disagree with that sentiment." She hesitated, then added more softly. "Tate Wilson informed me just yesterday that while my dedication to teaching is charming, I shouldn't concern myself with preparing frontier girls for anything beyond marriage and motherhood." Isaac felt a surge of irritation. Wilson has a remarkable talent for being wrong about most things. Abigail laughed, a free, genuine sound that filled the schoolroom. "I believe I managed to convey a similar sentiment, though perhaps with more diplomatic language." "Is he still pursuing you?" The question escaped before Isaac could consider its propriety. "Rather persistently," she admitted, her expression growing more serious. "He's proposed marriage twice now." The information hit Isaac with unexpected force. "Twice?" Abigail nodded, studying his reaction. "The first time was shortly after the harvest festival. The second was following the blizzard. He seemed to think saving me from frontier hardship was particularly urgent after seeing how close the Millers came to tragedy." "And you refused?" It wasn't quite a question. "Of course." She met his gaze directly. "Mr. Wilson sees me as an appropriate acquisition for a man of his standing, educated enough to be impressive, young enough to be moldable. He doesn't see me at all." The simple truth of her assessment resonated deeply. "And you want to be seen?" "Yes." She stepped closer, her voice softening. "Don't we all?" The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Isaac found himself acutely aware of her presence, the subtle floral scent of her perfume, the way her blue eyes reflected the late afternoon light, the slight rise and fall of her breath. "Abigail," he began, uncertain what he meant to say, but knowing something had to be said. The schoolhouse door burst open, shattering the moment. Mrs. Holloway hurried in, clutching a telegram. "Miss Jordan." "Oh," she stopped short, seeing Isaac. "I didn't mean to interrupt, but this just arrived for you. Marked urgent." Abigail took the telegram with a puzzled expression, quickly scanning its contents. Isaac watched as her face paled, her hand flying to her mouth. "What is it?" he asked, alarmed by her reaction. "My father," she whispered, looking up with shock evident in her features. "He's had a heart attack. They don't know if he'll survive." Isaac moved to her side instinctively. "Where?" "Helena. He went there 3 days ago for a banking conference." Her voice trembled slightly. "The doctor says I must come immediately if I wish to see him alive." Decision crystallized instantly for Isaac. "The evening stage to Helena leaves in an hour. I'll take you to gather what you need and see you safely aboard." Gratitude flooded her expression. "Thank you." Events moved swiftly after that. Isaac escorted Abigail to her home, waited while she packed essential items, and arranged with Mrs. Holloway to oversee the school in her absence. At the stage office, he purchased her ticket and spoke privately to the driver, ensuring he understood the urgency of their passenger's situation. As the departure time approached, Abigail turned to Isaac, her composure remarkable given the circumstances. "I don't know how long I'll be gone," she said. "Father has no other family. If the worst happens." "Don't think about that now," Isaac advised gently. "Focus on getting to him. Everything else can wait." She nodded, then impulsively reached out to grasp his hand. "Thank you, Isaac, for everything." The stage driver called for boarding, forcing them to part. Isaac helped her inside, their hands lingering in contact until the last possible moment. "I'll be here when you return," he promised, not entirely sure what he meant by the words, but knowing they were true. As the stage pulled away, Isaac stood watching until it disappeared from sight. The town suddenly seemed emptier, as if Abigail's departure had dimmed its vitality. He realized with startling clarity how deeply she had woven herself into the fabric of the community and into his own life in the few months since her arrival. The days that followed passed with excruciating slowness. Isaac threw himself into ranch work, preparing for the coming winter with single-minded focus. Yet thoughts of Abigail intruded constantly. Concern for her father's condition, worry about her traveling alone, uncertainty about when, or if, she would return. A week after her departure, Isaac rode into town, hoping for news. At the telegraph office, he learned that Harold Jordan was still alive, but in serious condition. Abigail had sent word that she would remain in Helena indefinitely. As Isaac left the office, Tate Wilson intercepted him on the boardwalk. The wealthy rancher looked smug, his usual arrogance amplified. "Porter, heard you've been asking after Miss Jordan." Isaac nodded curtly, not wanting to engage but unwilling to be openly rude. "Just concerned about her father's condition." Wilson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Thoughtful of you. I've been in regular communication with Abigail myself. In fact, I'm leaving for Helena tomorrow to offer my personal support during this difficult time." The deliberate use of Abigail's first name and the implication of intimacy it suggested stung more than Isaac wanted to admit. "I'm sure Miss Jordan appreciates all her friend's concern," he replied evenly. "Oh, I think my concern carries particular weight." Wilson leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Between us, I have reason to believe my third proposal will be more favorably received. Nothing like a family crisis to clarify one's priorities and the value of a secure future." The insinuation that Abigail might accept Wilson's suit out of fear or financial necessity ignited a slow burn of anger in Isaac's chest. "Miss Jordan doesn't strike me as the type to make life decisions from desperation." Wilson's expression hardened. "Perhaps you don't know her as well as you imagine, Porter. A woman of her background understands practical considerations. If her father dies, she'll be alone in the world. A schoolteacher's salary provides a meager existence at best. She's stronger than you give her credit for," Isaac countered, keeping his voice level with effort. "And not alone. This town values her." Town sentiment doesn't keep a woman warm at night or provide for her future, Wilson sneered. But by all means, keep clinging to your romantic notions. It makes my position all the more secure. With a mocking tip of his hat, Wilson walked away, leaving Isaac seething with frustration, not just at the man's arrogance, but at the uncomfortable kernel of truth in his assessment. If Harold Jordan died, Abigail's circumstances would indeed change dramatically. A wealthy husband offering security might seem more appealing in the face of sudden solitude. The thought haunted Isaac as he rode home. He had no right to begrudge Abigail whatever choice would bring her happiness and stability. If that meant marriage to Tate Wilson, then so be it. Yet everything within him rebelled against the idea of her tied to a man who valued her as a possession rather than a partner. For the first time, Isaac forced himself to confront the feelings he'd been avoiding acknowledging. His interest in Abigail Jordan had grown far beyond admiration or friendship. Somewhere between the storm-bound days in his cabin and their quiet conversations in her schoolroom, she had become essential to him. Her intelligence, her courage, her vision of a world where worth was measured by character rather than circumstance. But what did he have to offer her compared to Wilson's wealth and position? A small ranch, still developing. A simple cabin with none of the refinements she'd known in Boston. A man whose belief in isolation had shaped his entire adult life. The questions circled without resolution as November deepened toward winter. 2 weeks after Abigail's departure, the first major snowfall of the season blanketed the region. Isaac spent days ensuring his cattle had adequate shelter and feed, working until exhaustion granted him temporary reprieve from thoughts of Helena and what might be transpiring there. On the last day of November, Isaac was repairing a section of barn roof damaged in a recent windstorm when he spotted a rider approaching through the afternoon light. The familiar dappled gray coat of Willow was visible even at a distance, and his heart leapt with recognition. Abigail. He descended the ladder with reckless speed, moving to meet her as she rode into the yard. She was bundled against the cold in a heavy coat, her cheeks reddened by the winter air. As she drew closer, he could see the fatigue etched in her features, yet her eyes brightened at the sight of him. "Isaac," she called, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. He reached her side as she dismounted, instinctively offering support when she swayed slightly with tiredness. "Abigail, you're back. Your father?" "Recovering," she said, the relief evident in her tone. "The doctor says he was fortunate. The heart attack was serious but not fatal. He'll need time to regain his strength, but they expect a full recovery." "Thank God," Isaac breathed, genuinely relieved. Though he barely knew Harold Jordan, he respected the man, and couldn't bear to think of Abigail suffering such a loss. "But why are you here? I assumed you'd go directly to town." She looked up at him, something vulnerable and determined in her expression. "I needed to see you first, before anyone else." The simple statement sent a current of warmth through him despite the December chill. "Come inside," he said, leading her toward the cabin. "You must be half frozen." Inside, Isaac quickly built up the fire while Abigail removed her outer garments. The cabin was exactly as she remembered it from the summer storm. Simple but well-ordered, with the few personal touches that spoke of Isaac's character. The volume of Milton still occupied its place on the small bookshelf. As warmth returned to the room, they sat before the fire, Abigail cradling a cup of coffee between her hands. Isaac waited, sensing she had something important to say. "Tate Wilson came to Helena," she began, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "He arrived 4 days after I did, full of concern and offers of assistance." Isaac tensed, preparing himself for news he didn't want to hear. "He mentioned he was going." Abigail nodded, still not looking at him. "He was very attentive. Made sure father had the best medical care, handled arrangements with the bank, saw that I was comfortable." She paused, and he proposed again. The words hung in the air between them. Isaac forced himself to ask, "And your answer?" Now she turned to face him, her blue eyes direct and clear. "I refused him, just as I did twice before. But this time, I made it absolutely clear that no future proposals would be welcome." Relief washed over Isaac, followed quickly by confusion. He seemed quite confident that circumstances would change your mind. A flash of anger crossed her face. "He assumed my father's illness would make me desperate for security, that fear would accomplish what his wealth and persistence could not." Her voice hardened. "He doesn't understand me at all. What did he say when you refused? He was less than gentlemanly, she admitted. Suggested I was being foolish and ungrateful, that I would regret throwing away the chance at a comfortable life. A small, sad smile touched her lips. When that didn't sway me, he implied there was someone else, someone in Sweetwater Springs who had captured my affections despite having far less to offer. Isaac's heart began beating faster. Was he right? The directness of the question seemed to catch Abigail off guard. Color rose in her cheeks as she set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. Yes, she said simply. The single word changed everything. Isaac moved to sit beside her on the small sofa, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence, yet not quite touching. Abigail, he began, struggling to find words adequate to the moment. I'm not a wealthy man. This ranch is still growing, and I can't offer the kind of life Wilson could provide. I've never wanted wealth, she interrupted softly. I grew up with it in Boston and found it hollow after my mother died. What good are fine things when your heart is empty? The frontier is hard, he persisted, needing her to understand fully. Winters are brutal. Comforts are few. The life of a rancher's wife is not easy. Her eyes met his, unwavering. Do you think me so fragile that I can't endure hardship? Or so shallow that I would choose comfort over connection? No, he admitted. You're the strongest woman I've ever known. But you deserve everything good this life can offer. Then offer me yourself, she said with quiet certainty. Because in these past months, I've discovered that what I truly want, what makes life meaningful, is partnership with someone who sees me clearly, who values mind and spirit equally, who understands that true wealth lies in character, not possessions. She took a deep breath. Someone like you, Isaac Porter. Her declaration, so direct and heartfelt, broke through the last of his resistance. Gently, he took her hand in his. For years, I believed safety meant isolation, that caring for others was a vulnerability I couldn't afford on the frontier. He gazed into her eyes, finally allowing himself to speak the truth he'd been avoiding. But you changed that, Abigail. You showed me that real strength comes from connection, not separation. Is that why you saved the Millers? She asked softly. Because something in you always knew the truth, despite what you told yourself. The insight struck him forcefully. Perhaps, or perhaps you were changing me even before I realized it. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, Isaac leaned forward. Their lips met in a kiss that began tentatively, but deepened with shared certainty. Her hand came up to rest against his cheek, the gentle touch conveying a tenderness that made his heart ache. When they finally parted, Isaac found himself smiling, a full, unguarded expression of joy unlike any he'd allowed himself in years. I love you, Abigail Jordan. Have since that storm forced you to my door, though I was too stubborn to admit it even to myself. I love you too, she whispered back. Enough to brave Wilson's anger, town gossip, and even your own determined isolation. He laughed softly, marveling at her courage. Then there's only one question left. Taking both her hands in his, Isaac met her gaze with newfound confidence. Abigail Jordan, will you marry me? Not for security or practicality, but because together we're stronger than either of us could be alone. Her smile was radiant as summer sunshine despite the winter day outside. Yes, Isaac Porter. With all my heart, yes. Sweetwater Springs bloomed with new life as spring transformed the Montana landscape. The May wedding of Isaac Porter and Abigail Jordan drew people from miles around, becoming a celebration not just of their union, but of the community itself. Harold Jordan, fully recovered from his heart attack, proudly walked his daughter down the aisle of the small church. Abigail wore a simple gown of ivory silk, her honey blonde hair adorned with wildflowers gathered by her students that morning. Isaac, clean-shaven and uncommonly formal in a new suit, waited at the altar with a mixture of nervousness and undisguised joy. Never thought I'd see the day, Pete the blacksmith whispered to Mrs. Holloway as the ceremony began. Porter was the most confirmed bachelor in the territory until Miss Jordan arrived. Love changes a person, Mrs. Holloway replied wisely. And those two were meant for each other from the start. The reception that followed at the schoolhouse showed how thoroughly both bride and groom had become woven into the fabric of Sweetwater Springs. Miners and ranchers, shopkeepers and farmers all gathered to celebrate, bringing gifts both practical and heartfelt. Tommy Miller presented them with a hand-carved wooden box he'd made during his convalescence, pride shining in his eyes as Abigail hugged him tightly. Conspicuously absent was Tate Wilson, who had gradually withdrawn from town affairs after Abigail's return from Helena and subsequent engagement announcement. Rumor had it he was considering selling his ranch and moving to California, a development that caused few tears among the local population. As evening approached, the newlyweds slipped away from the festivities, riding together toward the ranch that would now be their shared home. Isaac had spent the winter months expanding the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and a small study where Abigail could continue her educational work during summer months. "Are you happy?" he asked as they crested the ridge overlooking their land, the setting sun painting the valley in gold and crimson. Abigail smiled, reaching across to take his hand. "Completely. Are you?" "More than I ever imagined possible," he admitted. "Though I still wonder sometimes what you see in a simple rancher when you could have had your pick of more established men." "I see a man who risked everything to save a family others had abandoned," she replied softly. "Who values people for their character rather than their circumstances. Who had the courage to question his most fundamental beliefs when shown a different truth." Her eyes met his with quiet certainty. "I see the man I love, and the future we'll build together." As they approached the cabin, now transformed into a true home with curtains at the windows and a garden plot freshly turned for planting, Isaac felt a profound sense of completion. The solitude he had once clung to as protection now seemed a pale shadow compared to the richness of shared life. That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching stars appear in the vast Montana sky, Isaac thought of Milton's words that Abigail had quoted during that long-ago storm. "Long is the way, and hard, that out of hell leads up to light." His journey from isolation to connection had indeed been long and difficult, requiring him to challenge beliefs he'd held as absolute truths. But the light, oh, the light had been worth every step. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Abigail asked, nestling closer against the evening chill. Isaac smiled, drawing her into the circle of his arms. "About how sometimes the frontier's greatest gift isn't freedom or opportunity, but the people we find along the way who change us for the better." "Then I am very grateful to the frontier," she whispered, lifting her face for his kiss. As summer settled over their ranch, bringing long days of work balanced by evenings of shared books and conversation, Isaac Porter marveled at how thoroughly his understanding of strength had transformed. What he had once seen as vulnerability, caring deeply, being needed, building connections, had become his greatest source of courage and purpose. And Abigail, his sweet summer bride, had been the catalyst for that transformation, showing him that even in the wild, untamed West, the human heart's greatest frontier was learning to love without fear.